The last couple years have been incredible for CSS. There have been so many new features that have come out, and they're absolute game changers for how I write CSS. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you my 20 favorite CSS features. I'm going to be going through them rapid fire so that you can get as much information as quickly as possible. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And I do want to say for every single topic that I cover in this video, I'll link to a video going fully in depth on that topic in the description. So if you want to learn more about any of these topics, check out the description for full videos on all of them. Now, the very first thing I want to talk about is layer, which is one of my favorite properties. It's been out for quite a while now, but no one seems to use it or talk about it. Essentially, a CSS layer allows you to create different layers. In our case, we have multiple different layers up here, and it allows you to create a different level of specificity. For example, I have a layer reset, theme, defaults, layouts, components, and utils. And since utils comes after components, everything in utils is going to be more specific than the things in components, even if the specificity is not exactly more. It doesn't matter what the specificity is. If it comes in utils, it's more important than components. I can actually give you a quick example of this by just using the star selector. This is the least specific thing you can do, but you can see by changing my color to red, it changes the text color of everything in my entire site to red because it's in this utils layer, which is the most specific layer that I have defined in my code. This is, again, one of my favorite features inside of CSS. I absolutely love it. Highly recommend you check out the video in the description that's going to cover layers in depth. You can even import on a layer like this. I can say I want to import everything in this theme file into the layer theme specifically, and that's going to import directly into that theme layer for me. Now, before we jump into the next topic, I do want to mention that all the different projects and code that I'm going to be showing you in this video is directly from my CSS Simplified course. If you're looking to master CSS from absolute beginner all the way up to incredibly advanced, brand new modern CSS features, this course is going to cover all of them with tons of projects along the way. For example, this Discord clone is one of the final projects in the course that teaches you everything that you need to know about CSS, and you're able to apply all your different skills. So if you're really interested in checking that out and taking your CSS skills to the next level, I'll link that in the description for you. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is going to be the text wrap property. So you can see I have text wrap of balance specifically set on this item. Let me just zoom this page in quite a bit so it's going to be easier for us to see. You can see that this text right now is split onto 3 separate lines. And as I make my page bigger and smaller, you can see it's going between 2 and 3 lines. But you'll notice the text is actually trying to be equally wide across all 3 lines. You can see it's balancing the text across all these different lines, so I'm not stuck with just like one single word at the end. If I remove my text wrap of balance, you'll immediately see now my text has changed where it's no longer trying to balance across all these lines, and I have this individual word at the very end, which generally doesn't look super good, especially when you have one line with a bunch of text and then one line below it with one single word. This is generally a not very good look, so text wrap balance just allows you to add in a little bit of that balance, especially for like headers and things like that. I find this incredibly useful. Another thing that you may notice about the actual code in this project is that there's a lot of nesting inside my code. For example, here I have my main header title, and I have multiple different media queries nested inside of this. And this is something that I do a lot inside of my code in CSS is use nesting, which is a feature brought into CSS relatively recently that you can use inside your code. And it doesn't just have to be media queries. For example, I could say I also want to select any time that this has the class red applied to it. Or I could say I want to select all the children that have the class green applied to it. I want to do specific things for those. It makes it really easy for you to do all this different nesting, and it's one of my favorite new features inside CSS. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is something that you've probably definitely used, and that is container queries. So let me zoom this out. I'm just going to hide my camera real quick. There we go. And you can see here that I have these different house cards showing up. And the really interesting thing about these house cards is they're not styled using media queries, they're actually styled using container queries. And that's because a container query allows you to style a specific element's width and all the different other things inside of it based on the size of the container of itself. So normally when you do a media query, it's based on the size of your page, which is great for page-wide things, but these house cards, you'll notice, they are different based on where they are. I have a sidebar over here with some houses on the right that are stacked vertically, while the houses on the left are stacked horizontally. And these both use the exact same CSS selectors, and that's because I'm able to use a container query. So when there's more than 450 pixels of space, I do a horizontal layout like this, while when there's less than 450 pixels of space, I do a vertical layout like this instead. And you can see as I change the size of this, my boxes are changing from that horizontal to vertical layout, entirely dependent on how much space they have and nothing at all to do with the size of my screen. This is a really powerful feature. I absolutely love container queries, especially when you're working in like a component framework like React. It makes writing responsive components incredibly easy since now it's not dependent on your page, it's dependent on the size of the component and container. Now, you've probably already seen all the stuff I've talked about so far, but one thing that you've probably not seen is relative colors, which is one of my favorite features inside of CSS. So relative colors just allow you to take one color and convert it using whatever functions and formulas you want into another color, and it can even be in an entirely different color space and so on. So for example, here I have a background color defined using OKLCH with some specific values for everything. And then what I'm doing to get my border for my button, I'm just taking that background color variable, I'm converting from that background variable, and I'm just taking the lightness value and removing 15% from it and keeping the rest of the values. So now my border is essentially a 15% darker version of that variable. Same thing here with my background color. I'm just taking my background color that I have, and when I hover over this, I'm making it essentially 7.5% darker by removing some of the lightness, and the box shadow around it is 15% darker. So you can see when I hover, I get all these different cool styles. And the great thing about doing all of these as relative colors is in order to make an accent button that has the exact same hovering effects and so on, all I need to do is define a single background color and all the other calculations are taken care of for me. So this is really great for doing calculation-based stuff, but it's also really great because you can convert, for example, from an OKLCH color to an HSL color and so on. So like if this was formatted in HSL, just imagine that was an actual HSL color, it's going to perfectly work when it converts into OKLCH with no problems at all. So it's really great for going between color spaces as well. And the next thing I want to talk about is probably something you've seen because it's one of the coolest features that's come to CSS in a long time, and that is essentially the parent selector or the has selector. So here I have some text boxes, and you can see when I have successful input, it shows me a checkbox off to the side, while if I have invalid input, it shows me a red X on the side. And all of this is handled entirely with CSS. There's no JavaScript at all on this page, and that is entirely due to a few things. First of all, I have some pseudo classes for valid or invalid input. That's just basic stuff that I'm not covering in this video, but the important thing is that I have this has selector right here. And again, I'm doing nesting inside of this. So what this code is doing is saying, okay, given an input group, I want to check, does my input group have an input with a valid user input? So if I have an input inside this group with a valid user input, I change all my colors to green and I show this check mark icon. If I have an input with an invalid input, I change to an X icon and I do all this other stuff. So this is code that is only possible because of the parent selector. Essentially, it allows me to change the style of a parent element based on things that are happening in the child. For example, I can change my input group colors based on what my input's valid values are. This is definitely my favorite feature in CSS that came out, and it's been out for quite a while, so it's available in every single browser. Now I have a kind of rapid fire list here of a bunch of different topics that didn't really fit super well into some projects, so I just want to cover them here real quick. The first one is going to be defining custom properties using the @property keyword. It works very similarly to how you can define a custom property like normal. I could just say custom like this and define a custom property, and that's going to work fine. You can see here I have color as a custom property and set it to green. Now, in particular, the nice thing about the @property syntax is that first of all, you can specify a type, also known as a syntax. And that means that it's going to be able to be animatable, which is really important. So if you've ever tried to animate a custom property, you know that it doesn't work. That's because it's missing this syntax information. So if you want to animate a custom property, use the @property syntax. Also, you can determine whether or not it inherits, because custom properties by default always inherit, so you can turn that off. And you can set an initial value. So by default, our body will have a color of red because this has an initial value of red. But if I define my custom variable anywhere else, you can see I defined it to green. So now my color is going to be set to green instead. It's just a really great way to add some like type safety and animatability into your custom properties. And I absolutely love it. I generally default to using normal custom properties, but as soon as I need the extra features, I jump to the @property syntax. Now the next thing here is Subgrid. It's probably something you've used before. It took a long time to finally come to browsers after Grid, but it is here in all browsers. And essentially all Subgrid allows you to do is to make it so a child element shares the same grid as a parent. So here we have a grid that has some template columns of 2 1FR columns and a gap of 2 REM. And inside that grid, we have a child, and we just specify the grid template columns to Subgrid. And now it's going to share the same 2-column layout, and it's going to share the exact same gap properties between these elements. So this is a really important property to be able to have, so we can just make sure our nested grids are going to properly work, because if you want to try to nest grids, it can be really difficult to make sure everything lines up unless you have grid template columns and subgrid set up. Now this next one is really not a new feature per se, but it's a new way of defining things that adds some extra flexibility for CSS, and that is the ability to define 2 different display properties. Essentially we have the inner display and the outer display. And this came about because normally you have like display block and display inline, and that determines how the element lays itself out. While when you have something like display flex or display grid, that determines how the child elements are laid out. So you essentially need to combine these together to have two different layouts. That's why we have properties like inline-flex and inline-grid that handle these combinations of these two properties together. But CSS kind of saw that this was not really a good solution, so instead they allow you to define the inner and the outer display entirely separately. So if I want an inline flex element, I define it as inline and flex, or I could have a block flex element and so on. Now by default, if you just say flex, it's going to default to block, kind of to work like it would before, but this now allows me to define essentially two different display properties, one for how it lays out itself and one for how it lays out its children, which is great for going forward. Also, a brand new display property of contents is really useful, especially when dealing with Flexbox and Grid, because sometimes you may have a Flexbox container. For example, this container is a Flexbox container, and you want to wrap a few elements inside of a wrapper to do something like change the color or whatever, but you still want them to be a part of that Flexbox container. Well, originally this was entirely impossible to do, but by setting the display to contents, what that does is essentially tells HTML and CSS to pretend like this wrapper div does not exist. So now these two div elements are directly inside my container, and they work in my Flexbox with my gap and my layout and everything just fine, but I still get the extra style of like changing the color of something with this particular wrapper. I really love this property because it's not really something you think is super important until you run into the scenario where you need it, and it is the only solution for this particular thing, so I'm really glad that it's part of the browser. Now, the last thing that didn't really fit into any of my neat code examples is logical properties. Essentially, this is the ability to define things like left, right, top, bottom, width, and size and height, and so on, using logical properties instead of left, right, top, and so on. So for example, padding left would convert to padding inline start. And the only difference between these is that the padding inline start will actually be based off the writing mode direction and the text orientation. So essentially, if you have a vertical writing mode, it's going to change the inline start to be the top instead of the left. And if you have, for example, a right to left reading mode, the inline start is going to be the right instead of the left because your text starts on the right of the screen and not on the left. This is just really great for supporting sites that do multiple different languages that read in multiple different directions. I'm sure it's not super common that you're going to run into this, but if you're working on a larger site translated into multiple different languages, this is very crucial for making sure everything lines up properly. Now we're going to start moving into some of the more experimental features that only have browser support in some browsers. So the very first thing that I want to talk about is actually something that's in all browsers, and that is the backdrop property. So you can see here this : backdrop, and down here I have the exact same thing, and down here I have the same thing as well. This allows me to style the backdrop specifically of a dialog HTML element. So you can see here I have a dialog HTML element, and then I want to be able to style the backdrop of that element. So if I open this, you can see I get this backdrop, and you can see when I close it, it animates itself out. So I have this nice little animation, and this whole gray background area, that is this backdrop property right here. So that allows me to style that, and that is available in all browsers. The things that are not available in all browsers is the ability to transition behavior with allow discrete, and also to do starting styles down here. So a transition behavior allow discrete just allows you to do a transition on something like a display property that has a binary on, off, yes, no, display none, display block kind of value. So anything that cannot transition between values, for example, scale, I can transition between 0 and 1 perfectly. But transitioning my display from block to none, that's a binary like on, off style thing. So adding transition behavior allow discrete allows you to actually put animations in that change your display from one value to another, and it's going to let the entire animation finish before it swaps that display to none, for example. Starting style is really useful because if you want an element to start in a specific state and then animate to another state when it shows up on the screen, so for example here when I click open, you can see that my modal is fading in, my backdrop is fading in and my modal is growing. That is only possible because of these starting styles allows me to set a starting location for these particular styles before they actually appear on the page, and then my transition is going to take over and transition them to the actual style that I want. Now the unfortunate thing is that Firefox does not have full support for these. So if we look at starting style here, this is at starting style, it only has about 86% support, which is relatively good, but it does not work in Firefox specifically when you're displaying things from display none. So if you're going from display none to not display none, starting style doesn't work, it won't work. You can use it for other things, but as soon as you're going from display none to not display none, it will not work in Firefox, which is a bummer because that's the main reason to use starting style. Also, this transition behavior of allow discrete does not work at all inside of Firefox. So again, you do not have support there. So again, it's only at about 85%. And that's kind of the theme of a lot of these different features is they will not work inside of Firefox. So now the next thing that I want to talk about is actually going back to that Discord clone. And if we just open up the code for this, specifically I want to talk about the property field sizing content. So I'm just going to move my camera out of the way because you can see this text box down here. As I type inside of this, it's actually going to automatically grow in size. This is entirely handled by CSS. There's no JavaScript at all. And that's because of this field sizing content property. It just allows text boxes, specifically text areas in this case, to grow in size based on the content inside of them. You can make it grow vertically, horizontally, or whatever you want. In our case, it only grows vertically, but you can change that to make it horizontally growing if you want. This is one of my favorite new CSS features that's coming out, but unfortunately it does not have super great browser support. So if we come back over here to look at the browser support, you can see Safari and Firefox do not support this at all. So really only about 70% of browsers support this. And I can move my camera out of the way so it's easier for you to see. There you go. Safari and Firefox, no support, but in the Chromium-based browsers, it does work. That should hopefully be something that comes to the browsers relatively soon, but even if it doesn't, you can throw this field sizing content in because it's not going to break these browsers like Safari and Firefox. It just means that your inbox or your input right here will not grow automatically in those browsers, but for the most part, that's probably okay. So you can really work around that. It's more of a progressive enhancement. And the next thing I want to talk about here is going to be the @scope property. And I'm just on the MDN documentation for this. The @scope property allows you to scope styles specifically to essentially a container. So I can say I only want these styles to apply to something that's in an article body all the way up to a figure. So it allows me to create a starting and an ending point where these styles actually apply to. Now, if I wanted, I could just have a starting point, so everything in my article body has these particular styles, or I can do a starting and an ending point to make sure that these styles only apply in between these two elements. So the parent has to be an article body, and the ending point is the figure, so if the parent is a figure inside the article body, obviously it wouldn't work. It must be in between these two elements. Now I can go even further, and I can actually define a scope inline in a specific style tag, and essentially it's going to scope with the parent element being this section. So everything inside this section has these styles being applied to it. Anything outside this section does not have those styles being applied to it. This is really useful, especially if you're doing something like React and you're making a component library and you want your styles to be scoped, but you want to write them in normal CSS. This scope tag is pretty much specifically meant to solve that problem. Now, of course, as the trend kind of is, you can see there's no support at all inside of Firefox for this. Hopefully it'll be coming eventually, but it's not something we can really use right now. Next feature I want to talk about here is definitely my most hyped for feature, and that is going to be the anchor property, and it allows you to anchor an element to another element's position. So all you need to do is whatever you want to anchor to, you give it an anchor name. So you can see we called this my anchor. And then when you want to use that anchor, you can, for example, use the top, left, and whatever properties. You can actually get that value by calling the anchor function and passing it in the name of the anchor as well as the direction of the thing. So I want to get the bottom of my anchor and set that as the top of my info box. And I want to get the right of my anchor and set that as the left of my info box. Now you can see here position anchor is set to that custom name up here. If you do that, it means you don't need to pass along the name of your anchor to the anchor function. That's the whole reason that we can get away with just calling anchor right instead of having to pass along the name of the anchor itself. And you can see if we come down here, we can modify exactly where that anchor is going to be positioned. Now I want to show you a little bit of a cooler example in my opinion, and that is down here. You can see I have this box, and as I move around these anchors, the position of all the things inside of my box is changing because the top left portion of my box is always set to the bottom right of anchor number 1, and the bottom right here is always set to the top left of anchor number 2. And if we look at the code for that, you can see it's relatively straightforward. You can see we set by position anchor, we set the top to the top of anchor 1, we set the left to the left of anchor 1, the bottom is set to essentially the top of anchor 2, and the right is set to the left of anchor 2. And I think right here, this is actually the bottom of anchor 1, and this is the right side of anchor 1. I misspoke earlier, but you can see that's how it's setting up the anchor, and everything else is handled entirely for you. So the only JavaScript on this page is just the JavaScript for me moving the anchor, but the actual position of this middle box is entirely handled by CSS. This is a feature I am super excited for to come to browsers, but unfortunately it's very, very new and early on. You can see it's really only got support around January or so of 2025. It's a late 2024, early 2025 feature, and of course Safari, Firefox have absolutely no support, so you definitely cannot use this in production, but this is something that I'm really, really excited for when it comes to CSS. Now the next feature I want to talk about is going to be specifically related to containers, but instead of doing a container on a particular element, you can do a container based on a style. So here I'm creating a container where based on whatever my container that I'm inside of is, I can say, you know what, when my style is a specific custom variable of blue for my accent color, I want to apply styles inside of here. So not only can you style elements in a container based on the size of your container, you can also style it based off arbitrary styles inside of that thing. So what is the padding? What is the custom properties? And so on inside of that container. It's something that there's not a ton of use for, I don't think, but in the scenarios where you need this, it'll be incredibly useful. I really feel like this is something that we need to come to the browsers and actually start playing around with before we start to see the real value in this particular thing, because right now I don't see a ton of use for it, but I do think there are specific use cases where you could use it. Now, if we look at the can I use for this, again, Firefox is not supporting this at all, so we can't use this yet, but it's going to be an interesting feature when it comes around. Now, the very last thing I want to talk about is something that you can actually probably start using even though not all browsers support it, and that is the interpolate-size allow keywords function. All you do is you just set this anywhere inside of your CSS, generally on the root property, and it will allow you to do animations using the calc property between auto and non-auto values. So if we scroll down here, you can see here that I'm setting my height to max content, and here my height is set to 2.5 RAM. And if we scroll down, you can see when I hover this, it's perfectly animating the height of this. Normally, if you try to animate height auto or height max content, it will not work. And the only reason it's working is because we set interpolate size to allow keywords, which allows us to do animations between things like max content, min content, auto, and so on. Just like pretty much every other topic inside this video, I have full videos linked in the description for all of them. But again, if we look at the support for this, it pretty much has no browser support at all. Really only Chrome and Edge have support for this. But again, this is more of a progressive enhancement. For example, if I didn't have this interpolate size and I hovered this, instead of animating, it would just instantly pop in at full height and instantly pop into minimum height between these different things. So instead of animating, it would just be an instant transition between these. So it would still work, it just wouldn't look as nice, which is why this is something I think you can actually start using, even if not all browsers support it. And that right there is all 20 of my favorite new CSS features. Now, if you want to stay up to date with all the latest and greatest CSS features and take your CSS skills to the next level, highly recommend checking out my CSS Simplified course. I'll link it down in the description before you. It'll take you from knowing absolutely nothing about CSS to being an absolute master in CSS and able to build pretty much anything that you can dream of. So if you're interested in checking that out again, the link will be down in the description below. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.